It don't need no reason to travel. Unknown horrors leaving in plain sight. Oh, God, stealing blade drives the world insane. Turn that evil darkness to healing light.
Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Dark Loops, the Seers of Ardham, a podcast in which scholarly, creative, over-the-top fans get together to discuss HBO's new fantastic series, Lovecraft Country. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University. And joining me in tonight's discussion are the other members of the Order of the Seers of Ardham. Brothers and sisters of the Order, please introduce yourselves and tell us why you're watching Lovecraft Country.
Hi, I'm Stanford Carpenter. I'm a cultural anthropologist. What compelled me to watch this was that I love the idea of a horror story that centers Blackness, but also leans into the racism of the source material that it takes from. There's also like another reason why I was curious about seeing this, quite frankly, is that my family does a 100-mile bike ride every year, and it ends in White Pines State Park in Illinois. And that's one of the places where they film. So we were planning on doing our bike ride a couple years ago, and they actually tried to convince us to cancel our bike ride. We said we weren't going to, so they paid for us to like stay, but we had to stay in our little corner. But it was kind of cool watching a movie where I could recognize some of the highways and byways.
Very, very cool. Leandra.
Hi, I'm Dr. Leandra Parris. I'm a school psychologist who specializes in traumatology and crisis response from an equitable lens. And I chose to watch this is the first time in my life that I'm watching something because my husband read the book and I didn't. So normally it's me. So he was the one who said, this book is great. Like, you're going to love it. I'm a huge fan of Jordan Peele. And so it's just, this along with Watchmen and just kind of like a theme for us during the pandemic. So that is why I'm watching it.
Fantastic. Cianna.
Hey, how are you? My name is Cianna Greaves. I am a radio producer out of Baltimore, Maryland. I produce a current affairs program on WYPR Baltimore. I also host and produce a podcast which centers on comics, pop culture, media, and film. And I am watching this much like Leandra. Definitely intrigued because I had read the book, Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff. I think this is one of those rare instances where I am confident that the television show might actually be better than the book. No offense meant to Mr. Ruff, but I'm really enjoying it so far. Also intrigued after seeing Watchmen on HBO, and also, we're there really isn't that much television. We're running out of shows, so I'm happy to have this offering so late in the pandemic.
Exactly. Byron.
Hi, I'm Byron Craig. I'm a professor at Illinois State University in the School of Communication, and I'm my work is in rhetoric and trauma and race. And I'm really interested in this show, and got really excited about it because I also study media. So I was really interested in thinking about the way HBO is starting to have these shows, and probably even more networks and media conglomerates are having these shows about race in this era that we're living in right now. So I'm interested in seeing how this develops, and I've never read the book. I know nothing about the book, so I'm really interested in looking at how this plays out and how it deals with issues of race. And also, I know I don't look like it, but I'm old enough to remember driving down south as just a child, my parents, and driving through different areas, and knowing my parents having this realization that we've got to get through certain areas and get to Troy, Alabama, which is where my mother was from, at a certain time. So, and that will, we'll talk about that later also, but just thinking about, this trauma that happens on Black bodies, right? It's replayed now through these shows like Watchmen and this one now. It's really interesting to me to see, what is, I'm also thinking about what is HBO trying to do at this point. So it's kind of fascinating to me.
Fantastic. Vanessa.
Yes, hello. I am Dr. Vanessa Hintz. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist here in the Milwaukee area. I'm also a professor of psychology at Alverno College and a diversity consultant. So I do a lot of work in diversity and inclusion and equity. And I am watching this show. I'm going to echo Cianna because the book, to me, I was like, what? And it was good, but it just, I'm interested to see how they take that and build on it, because I think the pacing in the book was weird. And Jordan Peele is just so great. And so anything that he does, when I heard that he was a part of this, that's when I read the book, and then I was like, ew. But I know that he will make it fabulous.
No,
so I'm excited.
That's fantastic. So I'm compelled to watch this show because I liked the book. And I was introduced to the book by Leandra's husband, Adam, probably about 2 or 3 years ago. And I really very much liked the Afro-Gothic vibe. Right? I mean, Watchmen was more of a science fiction-y thing, whereas this, for me, it harkens back to things like the recent comic series Bitter Root, it takes me all the way back to Zora Neale Hurston's Mules and Men and her work on Black folklore, right? And I just love that space. And so I'm delighted to have them, as Stanford said, turn that lens on Lovecraft and the vicious racism at the root of Lovecraft's horror, and sort of reappropriating what it was he was talking about, right? So I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. So what we're going to do here, and we'll start with Stanford, since we started with him before. I have 3 questions. What's your favorite scene, your favorite character, your favorite line? You can pick either one of those, give us an answer, and we'll go from there.
Well, I'll start with my favorite line. It was and it's connected to my favorite scene. It's towards the beginning where you have Atticus Freeman, where he's in the bus and the bus breaks down and they end up on the side of the road, and he's talking to the other Black woman who's the passenger, and both of them were sitting in the colored section, and a white guy comes over and picks everybody up, to take them to town, except for Atticus and the woman who was sitting next to him. I love how that scene lays out just how trepidatious the color line is, right? That on one hand you start looking at it in terms of, they're in the Black section of the bus, they're in the colored section, right? And you're thinking that that's the worst that can happen. And then the bus breaks down, and they're like, okay, so the bus breaks down, and they get left by the side of the road, right? And then the conversation, I love when she asks him about what he's reading, and he describes the science fiction, and she makes the comment that the lead character in John Carter of Mars was a Confederate soldier, and she says, and he says, well, she says that he was a Confederate soldier. And his response is, well, an ex-Confederate. And I love how she says, he fought for slavery. You don't get to put an X in front of that, right? And then his retort is also really interesting when he starts talking about how these stories were responding to the racism in the stories. And he says, stories are like people. Loving them doesn't make them perfect. You just cherish them and overlook their flaws. And I thought that was a brilliant comment, because it's also a meta comment on the whole Lovecraft Country storyline, right? But I think it also captures the ambivalence of even my childhood, when I think of growing up and reading stories of Black superheroes and white superheroes, and just being completely fascinated by comics as a media form, and yet being concerned about the content. And so all of those feelings just came up when he described that, and he actually goes on to talk about how he loves seeing these heroes. And so I think that to me, it's that combination of the scene plus those interactions where it just captures that even the most exquisite pleasures can also lie on literally the razor sharp edge of racism.
Fantastic.
And
go ahead.
If I may, it's
Please
interesting too, because I like that was the opening scene after the big colorful scene, but I was wondering, like, okay, how racist is this gonna be? Like, is this gonna be Remember the Titans racism, like Disney racism, not actual Disney racism, but movie Disney racism,
Right.
or is it gonna be like, I didn't know how intense it was gonna be. This is HBO, whatever, and so I feel like it got there at the end a little bit, and that's part of the reason. I'm ashamed to say I still have not watched Watchmen, because just emotionally I'm not there, given everything that's going on. And so I was even worried about that with this show, like, this gonna be a lot. And I feel like that opening scene with them on the bus, and then even when the truck came, and I was like, they're not gonna get on that truck with those white people. And there didn't have to be a big conflict scene, but it's like you just knew, and that was enough. You know what I'm saying? So I really appreciated that that's sort of the way that they, I'll say, eased into it, even though it got a lot more intense at the end, but I appreciated that for sure.
That would have been my favorite line. There's just another one that beat it for me. But the line about, novels are like, stories are like people. I just love that. And I love the generational comparison in those two characters as they were walking down the road together, both having experienced the same racism and yet having these somewhat different frameworks for understanding it and dealing with it. I thought that was fantastically well done. Anyone else want to comment on Stanford?
Yeah, and I'll say Stanford, that was the same line that I had chosen for my favorite line also. So thank you for that, first of all. But it really made me think about the, for me, of course, the whole Jim Crow that was being dealt with at that time, but also kind of the humility, because the fact that I thought it was kind of moving, it nearly made me cry when he said, "Let me help you with those bags," right? And so this kind of camaraderie between these two Black folk in this time, right? And what they had to deal with, and how humiliating that had to be for them, but probably understanding and used to that, right? That knowing that it was going to happen, but just, that kind of, I guess that camaraderie that was built there, right? And thinking about, and I guess the kind of the historical element of that for me was just really moving and touching, and thinking about, gosh, this is what these people had to go through. And again, for me, why I think I love the show so much was just really all in that one scene, with how, we're looking at how media is now trying to kind of tell these stories, right? We're getting these stories. And I think, and hopefully I don't upset anyone, but when I think about a film like, I'm forgetting the name of the film that won the Academy Award.
12 Years a Slave?
Green Book, right,
Green
Book. Which I was so pissed off about, right? I'm already, that scene there made me feel like, okay, I'm gonna get a story that doesn't try to placate white folk, right? Or make white folk feel better. So that made me really, really happy. That made me from the very beginning, and hearing just that scene and that line, right, coming from the sister saying, right, the X, just because the X is in front of it, right, just really gave me, I deal with trying to figure out, am I hopeful about a series, right? And that interaction and that line right there made me hopeful about this show, that it was going to do something. Again, having not read the book, was going to do something that, A, I could write about, and then B, that, was kind of a living kind of testament to me about, about Blackness and what we have to deal with in the United States.
Fantastic. Cianna,
Yes.
which of the 3 questions would you like to answer?
Well, I wanted to piggyback off of
Please go ahead.
what Byron was saying in regards to Green Book. Yeah, it does feel a little bit like a Green Book redo. And I think that's something we were all hoping for, at least I know I was. There's something very honest about this kind of storytelling. Stories about segregation, stories about Jim Crow, stories about racial violence and racial oppression should not leave you with warm fuzzies. You should not be, walking out of the movie theater with a smile on you. They're horror stories, essentially. And yes. I feel that, this is definitely the medium to tell these stories. One scene that I found very interesting was a scene when our 3 heroes, will say, arrived in Simmonsville. We're talking a lot about Jim Crow and what was it like to be an African-American during that time, to travel using the Green Book. I got chills because when they were, prior to their entering in Green Book, Miss Letitia Lewis says, since I'm not allowed to drive, I get to pick the radio station. And she picks, blues that's very, she picks loud blues, soulful music that's turned up. And when they were entering Simmonsville and they saw the firemen outside the fire department, instinctively I was like, turn your radio down. And there's something really chilling about that when you think of 17-year-old Jordan Davis, who was killed for that very thing not too long ago. When you think about Sandra Bland and Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered for being in the wrong neighborhood. He was in a neighborhood where he didn't belong. There was something very chilling about that. When they were leaving the diner and Letitia Lewis says, get up, we have to get the fuck out of here right now. I have been in situations like that. I have been in situations with friends and family where we're traveling, we're on the road, we sit in a restaurant, you just don't feel comfortable. In the 21st century. And it kind of does feel like a life and death situation. Like, let's go elsewhere. So I found that very, very chilling. And some really, really uncomfortable parallels to the world we're living in right now.
Anyone want to follow up on Cianna's comment?
Real quick, I think, Cianna, for me, just to kind of piggyback off of that. Well, let me wait, because that's kind of getting into my favorite scene.
Cool. All right, let's go on to Leandra. Which of the questions do you want to start with?
I'll follow Cianna and do my favorite scene, which I had a hard time, and I'm gonna go with the scene that didn't make me feel as uncomfortable, because I think the one scene that I really keep coming back to and have watched multiple times is the race for the county line. And that was just pure horror. And I don't know that I've ever been so scared actually watching a TV show as in that moment. But there's a lot to unpack there, and I think we're going to get there with other things to tie in. So the other one was the scene where Atticus and his uncle are sitting outside the house while Letitia's arguing with her brother, and they're talking about his dad. And they're talking about the physical abuse, and he's saying, the uncle's saying, like, he was younger, my dad went after him, like, I should have protected him. And I don't remember the exact line because it wasn't my favorite line, but Atticus basically is like, do you regret not protecting me? And like really throws it back at him and says, like, here you are trying to justify everything with my dad, and you're trying to, play like, oh, I feel guilty for not doing this. Like, you had another opportunity to protect me. You could have still been doing this when I was a child. It wasn't too late. And I just, the scene, like that whole scene and the look on his face where he like sits back and realizes like, oh, he's got me. Like, I can't even like respond to that. Just that intergenerational piece to that, and the different stakeholders in that was just, I think, really well done. And they don't come, like, it's not like so many other parts, it's not aggressive. It just is what it is. He puts it out there and they both go back inside the house. And I just think like it's a really good setup for the relationship between those two. And I don't know, maybe it's just my research and trauma and everything, like that whole, and generational trauma, that whole scene was just really, really well done.
And I think just to sort of like tie in what you just said, Leandra, and also what Cianna said, in terms of like this being the perfect medium for those two sort of trauma, like in the clinical sense, but also trauma in the racial sense. So like being Black in America is living in a horror movie all day, every day. And, you know, that's sort of what you're describing too, Leandra, in terms of like that, you know, trauma and physical abuse is like living in a horror movie every single day. And so I think that that type of, like you said, sort of like the county line scene, but then also like the scene that you just described, like that is horror on a different level, not like that type of thing, but like viscerally it's a different type of feeling. It's heavier. And I think that that's one thing that, again, I think makes the show so good, but makes it so taxing, you know, emotionally taxing to watch and to just experience, you know what I'm saying?
Well, one thing that also ties into that scene that made me shudder was the assertion of boundaries. So at that moment where Uncle George, where Atticus is hearing the commotion inside the house, and he's like about to go in, and Uncle George was he said, "Oh, no, you can't, don't interfere." And Atticus is like, "Why not?" And he's like, "That's family business, right?" And the layers in that scene I thought were really interesting, especially because it took me back to moments of like racialized violence and trauma, but it took me back into also the dynamic of that moment that makes it doubly horrifying, which is that there's often people who don't step in, right? This idea that something really terrible could be happening. We don't know what's going on there. We just know it's bad. But he's literally saying, "No, we're not going to get involved." Mm-hmm. And that was like that was actually the moment when I really had the most amount of closeness to Letitia's character. You know, I thought that was, and what I loved about, part of what I loved about how they did it was, it wasn't an aha moment. It was so casual, right? And I think that the casualness and the banality of that moment actually heightened, you know, just heightened the impact for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a question, and this might be a little off topic, but following up on, you know, bystander intervention and the scene between Atticus and his uncle, I'm asking our psychologist, I mean, when there is abuse in the family, it might not be your immediate family, but like you are aware of it. I mean, is there an onus on a family member as far as stepping in and sort of intervening or sort of playing a mediator there? I mean, do you think there was, obviously George and Atticus are very, very close, and there is a sense of betrayal there. I mean, do you feel like those feelings are misplaced?
Mm-hmm. I don't know which psychologist you're talking to, but
I'm
just gonna say something. Because I think what you're referring to, like bystander apathy, 100% is a thing in terms of like, mm-hmm. If a lot of people know about a thing, it's not my responsibility to do anything because someone else will do something. Mm-hmm. And I think in this case, though, what is more sort of salient to me is sort of like to what Stanford said, like those boundaries, which I think I would say, and Leandra, you can, I'm sure you see this as well, like in clinical practice, you know, sometimes those boundaries don't let anybody in, but they also don't let anybody out. So we get people that come to therapy at age 57 who've had trauma their entire life, but, you know, that's my family's business. And so I think that more so what is so pertinent is again, how do you define those boundaries and what is and isn't okay? And when we're talking about Black folks, like mental health is just another manifestation of the man. It's just another manifestation of the system. Who in that day and age and time would we turn to for help? The police? They white.
No,
social services? They white. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that we're seeing less of that now, but I definitely think that that sort of historical distrust of the system and the man attributes to that, like we don't do that because where are we going to go and what are we going to do? You know what I'm saying?
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
And then you're also going to expect other people to stay out of your ugly family business, right? And there's a sort of, I feel like, a bystander trade-off that goes on. And I think that's why a lot of this stuff gets buried. There's this sort of unspoken contract to keep it private, to keep it in the family. And it just amplifies over time. Absolutely.
I think to your point too, Cianna, about like the betrayal, like I know I do a lot of the research around bystanders of like peer aggression, but through that I've done a lot with like the domestic side of that. And we know that like the closer the family member is who knows what's going on, the more betrayal the person feels. And it's a secondary trauma that gets layered on top of that. And so, you know, it's his uncle. It sounds like, you know, that they're obviously very close. They have pictures of him up and he's very close to his aunt and his uncle, like absolutely betrayal. But I think to Vanessa's point, we see this with kids in school all the time. Like, who am I supposed to tell? My SRO? The police are going to come in and arrest me? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? And so there's a double betrayal that happens, both of society and of the individual. And I think that that is another layer that, you know, from a social justice perspective, I spent a lot of time in schools trying to unpack, because we do want bystander intervention. It's super effective, but only effective if they have someone to go to.
Yep.
So I think that that's a lot of onus to put on someone like the uncle. So yeah, I could just see both of them getting into it and going back and forth, but I think they both get it, and they just look at each other and kind of say,
right.
I think it also goes back to that first line that Stanford mentioned, where, you know, stories are like people. And there's parts of them you don't like, but you just keep moving.
Right.
And, you know, it's clear that he loves his uncle, and it's clear his uncle loves him. And it's clear they've never talked about that before, because the look on his uncle's face is, oh my God. And what I loved about the fact is he just absorbed it. You know, he didn't defend himself. He didn't try to invalidate his nephew's comments. And, you know, that's a good thing for culture to witness.
Yeah, that was actually really perfect. I was watching it and I was like, oh, I wish more people did that. I wish I did that more, you know, like.
Well said.
Yeah, and it, you know, real quick, I think it really speaks also to this notion of like this historical trauma and generational trauma also, right? So when I looked at that scene, it made me immediately think about, you know, not only what had happened between the family members, but like you were saying earlier, Vanessa, you know, dealing with, you know, being Black in that era anyway, right? And before that era, and the generational trauma that was probably passed down, you know, and not to mention, you know, our, you know, in some of the Black community, I'm hesitant to say in the Black community, you know, this notion of not airing your dirty laundry also, right? You know, don't put this business out in the street about the stuff that's happening in our family, right? So that's another reason why I appreciate that show so much, is that it's really, I think, you know, unpeeling all these layers of Blackness in a way, right? That I think we haven't seen dealt with in a show, you know, before. So I really appreciate that. And I love the answers to this question, because it's making me think about like the historical context of our mental health also, right? Emotional health, and how we're just now start getting ready at a place where we can start dealing with this, right? And that notion of fear, who do we turn to and talk about this? And did we really even have time to deal with that?
Yes. So on that note, Vanessa, what question would you like to answer first?
I got so much, but I'm gonna save this for a later time, talking about Letitia, because she is everything to me. And I've been rocking with Journey Smollett since Eve's Bayou days. So, but I'll go with sort of my favorite scene, actually was the block party, because visually, I think it was just stunning. I mean, it was beautiful. We got to see sort of the beginning dynamics between Ruby and Letitia, and sort of like that colorism issue at play. And, you know, like, even though, like, because I think that was a couple scenes after that opening scene with the bus and all of that, you see that, like, in the midst of all of this hate and drama and trauma and racism, that, okay, but we got this. Like, that block party was, everyone was having a good time. And then I mean, Atticus took his shirt off, which
Yes,
I didn't know. I didn't know.
that's when I look at Adam and I'm like, can you just go?
I know. I was like, okay. But I think that like you saw him and, you know, like just the kid, it was so beautiful. And again, like we, you know, if you read the book or even if you watch the previews, you know what's coming. But we got to see sort of this little pocket of serenity, joy, like black boy, black girl joy that I can imagine in that era. That's how you got it, is when we're together and we're, you know, we make it for ourselves despite all this that's going on. Like they made that, and again, it was beautiful. And then they sang, it was just so much. I loved it. That was my favorite scene.
Fantastic. I think what I'm going to do is talk about my favorite scene. And I got to explain why it was my favorite. So it's the scene where Atticus is in his uncle's garage, his auto shop. He's looking at the books that his uncle has already had there. And he picks out a Lovecraft book, Outsiders and Others. And then he mentions a poem about creation. And I have to admit that I had to look it up. Is this a real poem? The answer is yes. And when I read the poem, it talks about how a deity, the deities that created the earth, created an order amongst those in the human species. And I read that, and the reason I read that and it resonated with me is because I've actually been writing recently about the deist movement during the American Revolution, the type of belief that God had created all men equally. And the American Revolution, the colonists used that, what I'll call divine individualism, to justify warfare against the England so that they could, you know, have their own culture. Ironically, that deism was a part of the natural philosophy at the time. And people like Thomas Jefferson, who wanted to rationally believe that all men were created equal. And of course, I apologize for the inherent sexism in that statement, but this is what they wrote, that the idea that all men are created equal can be used in one context to justify your violence to be free. And then what you do is you use pseudoscience and history to then justify why you're allowed rationally to marginalize and traumatize others. So when you look at the type of things that were written at the time, Benjamin Rush actually wrote that the reason for black skin was because of leprosy that was genetically handed down. So what you have then is science actually being used to justify racial abuse. And once you can wrap it all up in the world of a deity, you can have absolute certainty. And it provides this incredible cognitive barrier that immediately shuts off your empathy to the suffering of those you're traumatizing. And it simultaneously lets you feel like you're superior in a natural, God-given sort of way. And so then to find out that Lovecraft, who wrote all of these novels about these evil deities that were out to drive the human species mad, that even in one of his deities is doing the same thing that the Christian deity did, right? They're all partitioning the species in a certain way. And when I saw the way Lovecraft wrote that poem and a deity had done this work, I thought, damn, that's just common among all these people, right? They just find a way to be part of God's plan for reality, and then they do whatever they want and go home and go to sleep. So I just, that struck me. And since I've been writing about that recently, it double struck me. And I was thrilled to have seen it. And I felt I learned something.
And like what you're speaking to is like also the way, you know, Christianity was used to justify slavery and like that entire evil business. And I think it's, and this would be an entire conversation for a different day, but I think that, you know, as, you know, in generations, like how Black people have taken back Christianity and then went away from, you know what I'm saying? Like that whole, this idea that we, you know, we have to separate ourselves from that because it was used to do, like, it's just an interesting dynamic that I don't know enough about to be like really commenting on it, but I just think that what you just said reminded me of that and how conversations about like the objectivity of religion and all of that, I think is
No,
interesting.
that's exactly what I'm after, and that's exactly what I write about, is the deconstruction of objectivity.
Hmm.
Because it's our commitment to an objective realm beyond lived life that actually allows those in power to identify with that realm and then do what they want to the lived life realm they're in. So no, this, for me, this is fascinating. I'm delighted that they brought that to the fore. And as Stanford said earlier, they're putting Lovecraft's racism front and center, and in a sense reappropriating it, which I think is totally cool.
Which I think is one of the great things about that sort of objectivity. Out of that springs some really interesting things. I actually did a show last week. I produced a show about the Black psychology movement and how it sort of, it sprang out of this very Eurocentric notion that Black people suffered from this self-hatred, and that we harbored this preference for white folks. And that was really the root of the problems in the African American community. So, I mean, I just, just to agree with what you're saying, out of, you have Black psychology, you have Afrofuturism, you have, the movement for Black history education. So there are positives that come out of.
Well, I think as we, go ahead, Stanford. I'm sorry.
It also makes me think of because I had a tie for favorite scenes. It makes me think of another scene, and it also and this scene also ties into Vanessa's scene of, in terms of the expression of Black joy, of Black joy. I love that scene between Uncle George and his wife Hippolyte in the bedroom.
Yes,
I loved it because it was just this moment of just like unvarnished old folk Black love. And we don't see enough Black love on TV, and we don't see enough old folk love on TV. It just hit both of them. Yeah. And I thought that there's something about that, and even how they they segue to the scene where the daughter's kind of grossed out and then she's scared by Atticus. The thing I loved about the follow-up to that was I loved George running out in the bathrobe that looked like it was his wife's bathrobe, right? It was like, but I love that. I loved all those moments. I love how like the imagery of him running out in his wife's bathrobe, because he wasn't going to sit around and worry about like anything other than his daughter. Like there's so much, that whole set of scenes, there was so much love. It was like seeing the look on her face when she realized it was Atticus, right? Like that those are so many interesting like cross currents of like I mean, I spoke earlier about how I love scenes that have a certain level of banality to them. I loved how it wasn't the aha scene. It wasn't, right. But it still carried the meaning in a way that an aha scene never could.
Well said.
I think following up on that, what Stanford's saying, and it's so true. Those are the most beautiful scenes to be able to see that, right? And I'm just interested to see what people think about this. This juxtaposing with that, with the scene where they're driving and we hear Jimmy Baldwin. Baldwin, right?
Yeah.
William.
Yes.
With the Buckley debate, right?
Yes.
But also the placement of Gordon Parks' images, right? Within the show as well, right? With looking at Black life in America. And to me, all that is also part of that joy, that kind of empowerment that Baldwin brings about when he's talking about, this notion that the American dream is at the expense of Black America, right? Juxtaposing that with the scene at the street party, right? At the wonderful scene of this couple making love, right? Being in their bed and being so close to one another, but also realizing that with those scenes, the reality of Black America is that we can have those moments, but we also have these moments, right? And what's the sense of these other moments that Baldwin and Parks in his photography certainly were speaking to. So I think so far for me, they're doing a beautiful job of kind of enveloping all that together, right? And making us understand, and maybe it's making us understand the complexity of Black life, right?
Well, it's the complexity and it's that shadow of, pardon me, I'm sorry, of oppression and fear that follows you everywhere you go. I mean, that is what the Green Book, I mean, that kind of what the Green Book encompasses, you know what I mean? This idea that, you know, it is a book, you know, created to keep people of Black folks safe while they do something as simple as take a road trip, go on vacation. So, yeah, no, I agree with that 100%.
And I think to both Byron and Cianna's point, specifically about the psychology piece, psychology still today is white as hell. Like, it is white. And I think that there are so many, like sort of, we're getting to a point now, slowly but surely, that we have to expand our understandings of what is normal, what is typical behavior, like all of these different things, because everything in psychology is rooted in whiteness and European, like, ethnocentrism. And so it's like, I think that that's, to Byron's point, one reason that those sort of like tender and loving scenes, and like to Stanford's point, are so awesome is because for so long, like, Blackness was demonized and othered and a disease and all of these things, and less, you know, and still is, I would argue, less than. And so I think that even now in contemporary psychology, in this year of our Lord 2020, we are still fighting to, as clinicians, to say, like, you can't treat this Black or brown child, this, you know, like, it with the same set of parameters and the same set of rules that you treat other, you know what I'm saying? And like, working in social justice and all of those different things. And I think that it's both exciting, but also disheartening, because how long ago was this set? You know, how many years ago? And we're, you know, like, we're still in psychology, like, working on that. It's just, it's an interesting sort of paradox.
Well, yeah, Vanessa, you and I were chatting the other night about the idea of management versus being right and wrong, right? And everybody in this show is managing, right? They're managing their lives. They're extremely aware of the context that they're in, and they're organizing themselves in that spaces. And the idea of being right, whatever that means, or being wrong, whatever that means, is not the driving force of what they're doing at any given moment. The problem is when I say things like that, it falls on ears that believe I'm saying someone's immoral. And that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is life is highly complex, full of love, full of hate, full of all kinds of things that are intersecting at every moment. And these characters are letting all of that intersectionality be expressed every moment. And I just find it fascinating. They're not trying to persuade anyone that they're right. They're, you know, and I find that fascinating. So, Byron, what would you like to do for your second question?
Well,
favorite line, favorite scene, favorite line.
No, because my favorite line was the same about the, you know, at the bus with her saying,
yes,
taking the X off of it. I will say, you know, and I really, it's hard for me to think of a favorite character so far, but after doing a little research, I have decided that so far, I have to say my favorite character is Letitia so far, because I can't get past that damn running scene with her.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Yeah. I tell you.
It really kind of represented this notion of, you know, this fear in Black people, that horror, and also the notion of, you know, both those creatures and what had just happened to them, right? I think she embodies that beautifully, right? We see her and we see those close-ups, and we see her from above and how she's hoofing it. That just, to me, just drew me to her so much. you know, and, you know, again, like, yeah, I've been a fan of her since, you know, since Eve's Bayou, right? But, you know, just to see her kicking in that scene the way she did, right? And in a sense, becoming really the, you know, the heroine of that scene, right? She's the one that saves lives there, you know,
Yes.
in that moment, you know, and who says, I will, you know, when they send her, when the white cop says she has to go, you know, she's doing the Lord's, what is she doing? Yea, do I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? So we see that kind of spirituality coming out, but also this kind of, you know, I'm going to do this shit. I'm going to save these lives, right? All at the same time is embodied in her. And again, I know nothing about the book, and I'm kind of happy I don't. So I'm really interested to see what happens with the character. But, you know, it was hard for me to, you know, throughout watching the show, I kept thinking, I don't know who I like so far in here. Because I'm, you know, I'm sort of on the fence. I'm having a problem with Atticus right now, but, you know, really, when she did that, that to me was just like, here we go. And I had to say, it's representative of where we are in our culture again, with black women taking the lead, right? This is taking the lead, and that's what she did. She took that lead, and it was just, to me, just was exhilarating. And just kind of made, I actually jumped up off the sofa. I was like, damn, yes, go, right? None of my poor neighbors are like, what's going on up there now? But you know, it just was really, it gave me life, because it was just like everything in that moment to me. I mean, she embodied so much about Black life in America. Just in that, I felt everything when she was running to that car.
I'm going to say it wasn't my favorite scene, but her conversations with her sister Ruby, I thought those conversations were just fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, both of them being a foil for each other, you know, in terms of exploring both characters. And I absolutely love Ruby's character. I thought it was some of the best acting in the episode. You had absolutely no doubt she knew exactly who she was. You know, Letitia does know who she is. She has other contexts to explore to fulfill who she believes she is. Ruby knows who she is, and she's where she wants to be. I mean, that's the way they present. I mean, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I just loved how they used those two characters to explore each other. And even though they didn't have a whole lot of time together, I absolutely loved it.
I think I think Vanessa was saying this earlier, that it really speaks also to the notion of the embattlements of color difference, right? And, you know, so many people, I know my grandmother and her sister were treated differently by their mother, because you know, my grandmother was darker skinned and her sister was fair complexion, right? And so you see that within that moment, in that scene with those two sisters, you see that playing out also. And I think that's part of that complexity also of relations, of Black relationships, right? So yeah, I agree. I think it was just, you know, you see there's so much in that scene. Like, I think in all these scenes. So.
And I feel like in that block party scene, like you saw it when Letitia was coming up on the side of the stage, and they were like, "Oh, Ruby, your sister," and she like, and then, you know, it took her a while to warm up to them singing together, but then obviously it was amazing. But it's like I felt that Ruby was like, "Dang," like I was shining, and then here she comes, you know what I'm saying? And so it's going to be interesting to see.
Is that because she's light-skinned, or is that colorism issue, or is it an issue because she did not go to her mother's funeral?
Well,
I think it's all of those.
Letitia would have been my favorite character had she gone to her mother's funeral. I mean,
there you go.
Like, I haven't read the book, but I'm really hoping, does that get explained at all? Like, I don't she's to answer that, but
fighting with her brother, and she goes, "Are you going to keep bringing that up?" He was like, "Absolutely."
Yeah, there you go.
Because didn't they say that she used the money that he sent her to get someone out of jail?
Yes.
Right? You know, someone out,
yeah.
So there has to be some kind of story there, some kind of story there. Probably, and remember again, you know, that trauma that probably happened between, you know, these two sisters. I mean, we don't know who, someone might have said something in that family about, you know, this one's favored. Right. She looks, right?
I feel like Letitia is just sort of aloof about her own, like she just seems very unaware of her own privilege.
Mm.
And that seems, I mean, it's clearly gets under her sister's skin and possibly her brother as well. And Stanford, you brought up a really interesting point. We had been talking about this a couple of days ago about how the story would be different if Ruby was traveling
Yes.
with the other two rather than Letitia, simply because Letitia, I mean, could pass for white, and how that would change the dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually, I mean, I'm a little more ambivalent about Letitia. I mean, there are scenes with her that I love, but I think that Cianna actually just brought up my ambivalence about her character, right? I feel like you can kind of see some colorism playing out, but I also feel like I don't feel like the writers of this story have really put much thought to it. I think they you know, and I was also thinking in terms of like when they go into Simmonsville, right? It's like her likeness would have changed that dynamic a little bit. I think that, and I'm hoping that they're able to kind of delve into it. But she's incredibly light in comparison to the two black men that she's traveling with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's just something there that like I'm waiting. That's one thing I'm really waiting and watching for the show to start to feel out, because they've tapped onto so many other subtleties. For them to miss this would be a real shame.
Right.
You know, I mean, another scene that but there are also a couple of other scenes, and I like scenes that involve sort of role reversals in terms of genre assumptions. Like the scene when they're pulled over to the side of the road and Atticus took his shirt off and he's like giving himself the sponge bath, and she sneaks behind to like cop a couple pictures of him, you know. I enjoyed that. That was another moment that I really enjoyed, right? It's just it was a little bit of a role reversal for the genre. And actually I thought that was the scene that they were gonna have a cop roll up on them. I actually was more afraid during that scene than the later scene when they're at the side of the road and they actually do have the cop roll up on them.
I too very much enjoyed that scene for a different reason, but
Yes, ditto.
Vanessa, what's your second question?
So we already talked about Letitia fucking Lewis. I'm just gonna keep going and not beat that into the ground.
She beat you to it, Stanford.
I'm sorry, I know I didn't want to steal your thunder, but it was like the perfect moment. You can edit that out. If Stanford says it later,
All
edit that
good.
part out.
It's right out of the show. We're good.
This is actually something that I wouldn't say is necessarily a favorite character, but I'm interested to see what happens with it, because I think there was speculation that Caleb is now Christine, or a like, so Caleb from the book is now
right.
Caleb was his name, right? The son, brother, I don't know. He is now a woman, and then they changed Uncle George's son to a daughter. And so I'm actually interested, and sorry for those who have not read the book, but I'm actually interested to see if Caleb is a woman, how that changes a lot of things that happen in the story, and even the dynamic between that character and Atticus. Like, I'm just very interested to see what happens with that. And I like the way they sort of introduced I don't know what kind of car that was, the silver car, but how that car was almost its own character in the story. And then to see it on screen, I was like, oh my God.
That
like,
was very cool.
I'm so excited. And so I'm just interested to see how they deal with that, the things that they changed. And so, like, obviously changed, what comes of that, you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Cianna, what's your second question?
I guess my favorite quote would be next. Sorry, I have notes.
I think we all have some kind of notes
here. I have two quotes that I really liked, and they were both from that final scene, or second to last scene in the cabin. One is when Atticus says, "I'm not scared because fear is not going to save us right now." And that's what really sends Letitia fucking Lewis out on her sprint.
Yeah.
And my second favorite quote was Uncle George, where he actually quoted Bram Stoker. He said, "Children of the Night, what music they make." Because Dracula is one of my favorite books of all time. One of my favorite quotes from Bram Stoker's Dracula. And the monsters in Lovecraft Country, I mean, we waited nearly, 40 minutes to make their appearance, and it was worth the wait. They were terrifying.
Oh my God.
I mean, the sugar had me shooketh. I was absolutely craving. It was,
Yeah.
and it was definitely worth the wait. So yeah, actually that scene in the cabin was probably my favorite scene. Ended up being my favorite scene in the whole episode. It was absolutely
fantastic. Leandra, what's your second question?
I'm gonna do the favorite character because I feel like I did my quote and my scene all together into one. But I actually really like. I think her name's Diana. It's the daughter. Vanessa was just talking about her. The uncle's daughter.
Uncle George's daughter. Yeah.
Yes. So that scene, first of all, when she's embarrassed, so I think Stanford brought that up. Like, that is so gross. And I was like, that, I don't know why that tickled me. But then I realized that she was drawing a comic book. And I love the visualization of a young Black girl into comics and is rocking that house. Obviously, she's doing the checklist. Like, she knows everything. Like, she's arguing. I think it's her that's arguing with the white policeman who's trying to turn off the hydrant. Like, just that whole thing, and the fact that she gives the comic book to her dad, and it's in that like wide rule paper. Like, she's just done such a good job. Like, so that just said so much about who she is, and I don't think we see that enough. This idea of a young Black girl into comics and being creative and also assertive and being in control and taking care of people. And so I just found that whole thing, I just loved her. Every time she was in the scene, I loved her.
Yeah, I love that character. I love what you're talking about the writing of the comic book, and not to get too metaphoric, but I love the idea of writing your own story, right? And putting it down on paper. All I'll say is there have been times in my life where putting it on paper was healing, right? It allowed you to move forward thinking of yourself as a certain way, right? And you can, it's the weird psychological phenomenon of actually putting something outside of you, put it in an image or put it in text. Once you go back and read it later, it still feels other. Even though you wrote it, it still feels other, and not in a bad way, but in a healing way. And so I like the idea of managing identity through creating external media, like, for example, this show, right? Putting this story in the world and letting it guide you into a different view of the future, of who you are and who you can be. So I absolutely loved it.
Well, it's also interesting because to me, when I think of it in terms of artifacts, right? It's like they actually, so you have these artifacts that serve this really interesting purpose, but what's also interesting about it is that, they went to, there's actually two Black female comic creators who played really interesting roles in this. So the Young Girls comics were actually drawn by Afua Richardson.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And the monsters at the end, the person who did the design, who was in on the designs for that, was Ashley Woods. Yeah, and so I think it's interesting that I always get interested when you start when you also start seeing that you've got them really thinking about, they could have had anybody. They could have had, in theory, they could have anybody make those artifacts. But I would like to believe that picking Black women to be involved in creating the comic artifact, and then also designing, being in a part of designing the monsters. I would like to think that was important as well.
No, I think that's fantastic. I mean, it goes back to in Watchmen, the people they had writing Watchmen, the people they had writing Black Panther, all of this comes into the culture as another level of the story, right? And it actually creates culture, right? And the more we persist in making that culture exist in our face, the more that's what we live. I mean, that's the I'm going to say, I mean, everybody kind of knows it, but it's amazing how often we sit around and look at the world and act like someone else made it that way, right? Or we look at things and don't tap into our own creative abilities to work to make things the way we think they should be. Now, different people have different levels of power, and this is obvious. This is obvious. So I'm not trying to, put everybody in equal plane and people should have done this. What I'm saying is tapping into our collective ability to create cultural context is something that I'll say that I would say that power is being reawoken in American culture right now, and it's absolutely thrilling. And
But
so,
it's also interesting what's being created. So one thing that I also found really interesting in some of my conversations afterwards is thinking about the Green Book, right? Thinking about the way media is now starting to move away from, I mean, earlier we talked about 12 Years a Slave, right? And I remember, I kid you not, when I walked out of 12 Years a Slave, one of the people I saw it with asked me how I felt, and my first reaction was, well, 4 years was enough. And that's, I mean, because it was just this constant trauma, and it was battery, and it was torture, and I was like, I didn't need that, right? But now look at the landscape that's being created now. I mean, whether it's comics like Bitterroot or this renewed interest in the Green Book, right? It's actually recontextualizing.
Yep.
It's recontextualizing Black history and the Black experience, moving away from, it's about being captured, it's about being enslaved. The Green Book is I look at the Green Book as literally an extension. It's being written as an extension of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad didn't end; it evolved. This idea of us as Black people having to go and forge and create safe routes through this grand America that we live in, right? It is exactly the project of the Underground Railroad. Routes to safety. It is exactly the project of the Green Book, right? Exactly. And interest in that, and interest in maroon culture, Marinage, right? Having studied that as an archaeologist, it's like it's what's fascinating is that you have to reconfigure your relationship to time, space, and movement, and doing that actually it positions African Americans to instead of thinking of it in terms of someone setting us free, right? It actually really emphasizes the journey into something else, the journey not just against all odds, but against all fears. And we see the fears. We see the fears in a white cop who there's literally a file folder of all the people who he stopped along the way. We see the fears in terms of these monsters, right? That have all these many eyes. That in the end we realize are transmogrified white men. I mean, all of that comes together in a very interesting way to me. And that's one of the things that I actually loved about seeing the first episode of the show, is being able to make those connections and being able to see to even see all the creativity going in that direction.
That's fantastic.
And I just also want to say that, piggybacking off of what Leandra said, Diana's a great character because it's very rare still to see Black children being able to be Black children on screen. I mean, media has really played a huge part in this notion that Black childhood doesn't exist. Black children aren't curious. They aren't creative. They aren't, they don't have imagination. They're always, sort of fighting their own trauma, taking care of a family member. I mean, just this, erasure of Black childhood that manifests itself in the violence that we see against Black children today. So it was really, really nice. I agree with Leandra to just have a young Black child on screen, just being a child.
And I just realized that is why I really loved it. I think you helped me figure it out. It wasn't just the comic book piece. It was just her whole curiosity, and she's in the, playing in the water, and she loves her cousin, and just like the whole thing. And I think that being in education so much, and that's where all of my work is, I constantly deal with push out of Black girls, constantly exclusionary disciplinary practices that are way overrepresented and extremely violent. And so to see her just playing was just very, thank you. You helped me understand more about what it was, because it was more than just the comic book. I just couldn't figure out what I was drawn to.
Fantastic.
Question: When she's sitting there drawing, and I have a couple of things I want to add. When she's sitting there drawing, and isn't she using the image? Is she using the image of a family member when she's drawing that comic? When she's making that character?
I thought so too, and that's the one thing that I managed to write down was that is this her younger mom, or is this her aunt that died who's Atticus's mom? Like I felt like it was somebody, because it did, or is it an advertisement? I never went back to go find out.
Because I think it adds, and there's a couple of things here. I think it adds to this beauty of this young Black girl kind of creating, right? But is she creating from a memory, right? Is she creating and empowering other Black women, in her family to kind of give us, to create this image of power and, this superhuman strength of survival. But I want to go back to something also that, Stanford, when you were talking, it was making me think about Toni Morrison and how she taught. And I think one of the things I like so much about this first episode for me was that we're allowed to have these, I think, unspoken spaces. And Toni Morrison kind of talks about this, right? When she does the, when she does the intro to the Black Book, she's kind of talking about these, how these artifacts allow us to think about and start piecing together these stories of Black life, right, in America. And I love when you talked about the, this notion of the, from the Underground Railroad to the Green Book, right? We're being empowered to, I think we think about those kind of artifacts. As a rhetorician, it empowers me to start telling these stories about Black life, right? So I use artifacts in a way that allows me to tell stories about, how we empower ourselves, right? Or how we've been disempowered through these artifacts of sorts. But it just made me think, it really made me think about what, about what would Morrison think about, seeing something like Watchmen or seeing something like this show, and how is it giving us these, I'm seeing these, for me, I'm having to piece together a lot with this show because, again, I haven't read it, but I'm loving having these kind of spaces where I'm trying to write this story about this. And that's what I've been hearing tonight as we've been talking. I think that's what makes it so beautiful for me, is that I'm having to piece things together. These spaces that I don't know about yet that are happening in this show. And in this first episode, there's a lot that's unanswered for me still, but it's offering me, it's an artifact that allows me to start thinking about this connection between where we are now and that, Jim Crow America, right? And what these people were having to do. But I'm really drawn to this notion of this, this continuation of this Underground Railroad, right? This travel into something, so that, is really sticking with me in a really profound way. Yeah. So I
think I'm going to go ahead and do my second bit here, my favorite line, and it's from James Baldwin. That scene was stunning. You have basically a drone filming 3 people on a road trip. In other words, there's this montage of people driving across the Midwest, the Northeast. And how many times have we seen those images of white people with the top down and they're all just doing whatever they want? And it's like, yes, we're expressing our freedom. And you have this group driving down the same highway, blaring the radio, and then you have James Baldwin over the top of it, and it's just something I've not seen before, and I thought it was beautiful. And I actually want to read a quote if I could, and then I'll explain why for me this completely matters. So one's reaction to that question has to depend on effect, and in effect where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is, what your system of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions which we hold so deeply so as to be scarcely aware of them. On the one hand, that kind of understanding of unconscious assumptions is kind of, we all know that to some extent, right? There's this brutal irony to the extent that we can consciously say we know that, but we still don't experience ourselves as doing that because the assumptions are unconscious. And one of the things I've been studying my entire career is how these unconscious assumptions about how our bodies move, how our perceptions take place, and how our thoughts occur are all being framed by unconscious assumptions that emerge out of lived life. And of course, so I love Baldwin's bringing that to our attention. And I love the fact that this show, hopefully, and other things that are going on in what I'll call our current narrative culture, is starting to draw us to an understanding that the brain is what I call a hope-filled cage, right? That we can't function in daily life without unconscious assumptions. They let us not be schizophrenic. But what we can do consciously then is reorganize the world so that we generate different unconscious assumptions. So the consciousness comes in and consciously reorganizing. This show is a conscious reorganizing of American narrative. Watchmen was a conscious reorganizing of American narrative. Why does that matter? Because after we live in this over and over for a while, it becomes unconsciously expected. So I just love the way this is doing the work that we need to do. And to be honest, it's doing it in my favorite way, which is TV shows, right? Which I can just get lost in and talk about for a couple hours with people once a week. So I just love drawing that to our attention. And then getting to talk about it with you guys is more, another layer of the narrative.
And it's interesting too that you bring that up, Scott, because I don't know if anybody is familiar with the concept of geek therapy, but that's essentially what it is utilizing these narratives in a way that is safer because it is part of us, but yet othered. And so like we've been doing all night, right? Like talking about how we perceive the episode, what spoke to us, and that in turn reveals something about us,
yes,
but in a safe way to where I'm not telling you all my business. You know what I'm saying? And so I think I think that's why popular culture is so powerful, not only just to us societally, but even just like in a therapeutic space, because it allows us to go places that, again, for people who have been marginalized or othered may not feel safe going personally, but through whoever, through Black Panther, through Nakia, through whoever, through anybody in this show, we can go there. You know what I'm saying?
That's fantastic. And then by going there, rewrite history. In other words, create a future that becomes history. And it's conscious work. And that's what I find so incredibly exciting about now is we're seem to be gearing up culturally to do the work. And that's just, it's a thrilling time to be alive. So absolutely.
Can I just say everything you said is what I do with my students who have trauma. And I did the whole like comic book story thing with all of my students who are like refugee status from Myanmar. And it's so effective and it's so just such a great approach. I just want to put that out there. That it's
Yes.
everything you just said is so on point, and it works in schools.
You know,
I don't know who's listening who needs to hear this, but it works in schools. I don't know why schools don't do this more.
Say that.
They're still too cognitively oriented.
They're not colonized, or too colonized. That's what I'm trying to say.
Fair enough. What I also want to, since we're on the thing, I just want to say what I love about comic books is an image is worth 1,000 words, and picture stories are able to get to the joints of the issue quickly. You don't need a page and a half of text to describe the layout of the land, right? And you don't need another 2 paragraphs to understand the complexities of that person's mood. It's all there in the image. And in a good comic, the text actually adds another layer of contradiction, another layer of juxtaposition. So again, I'll stop there because that's a little left, but
that's I would say one thing to that. I want to give a shout out to someone. There's a great book called No Caption Needed by John Lucades and Bob Harriman. You know the book? Excellent book that really talks it and picks up on this notion of image. But I also want to say something really quickly about this notion of rewriting, of creating a narrative of history. And it might be a little bit of pushback, but I don't think so. I think it just complements it maybe. That, you know, I've been grappling a lot with thinking about John Lewis, who was, you know, again, from Trial, Alabama, the same place as my mother. And I used to always think, why does he always constantly tell this story about the Edmund-Patterson Bridge and what happened on that bridge, right? And I'm tying this into these shows like Watchmen and Lovecraft Country. This retelling of this narrative, right? And I think it's this retelling of this narrative. I think it's reinventing or retelling a history. Well, I think it's telling this history because there's so many people, you know, already I've been seeing this stuff on Facebook about people asking, what was all this about having to get out of these places at a certain time before the sun went down, right? And so it also speaks to, I think this show and Watchmen also have this wonderful, they do this wonderful work of saying, this was a history that happened, right? That you might not know about, and you don't have to know about it. You know, you haven't had to know about it, right? Because you've lived this privileged life. But for my parents, for my grandparents, this was a reality for them, right? So I think it does this job of, I guess, of you know, rewriting a history, but also informing us of a history. A lot of people haven't had to know, right? Haven't cared to know about. So you know, I think it does this great work as a rhetorical artifact, as a media artifact of you know of putting these ugly parts of America out there. I have to grapple with. Because remember in that first episode of Watchmen, everybody was like that first night, what the hell was that? What about Tulsa? You know, and so you're starting to get that same reaction from, you know, from this show, right? That people are saying, what was all that about having to be chased, you know, get out of a county or a town or a city before the sun goes down, right? So you know, it's allowing us to, you know, to really, I guess, see where Americans are with this lack of, and it could be maybe they know about it but don't want to deal with it, right? And so now again, it's being thrown in our face, and we have to grapple with that history, right? So
I agree. I mean, one thing I am seeing on social media as well, in the comment section are, sundown towns do exist. You know, I'm seeing people across. I can name 3 or 4 towns in Maryland that I would not be caught dead in. After dark. And it's you know, it's public knowledge, you know what I mean? It's not a secret, it's public knowledge. But you know, people are recognizing and speaking out and saying, this town next to me, the town that I live in right now, you know, if you were a Black person or a person of color, it is not recommended that you know, come here. So, I mean, I
like how you say that. It's not recommended that you come. I mean, and it's actually doubly funny because that is how people say it. We don't recommend you come here. Yet in this show, we saw what really happens when you come there, right?
Right.
They drag you out in the woods
Mm.
and they put guns to your head.
Mm-hmm.
And the monsters don't save you.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I love your point too about I forget how you said it, but something like learning the history. I think too, like I know when I watched Watchmen, like I knew about Tulsa, but I remember looking at my husband and being like, were there planes? And he was like, Leandra, there were planes. And I'm like, there's something about the intensity
Yes.
of, even if it's in the history book, even if it's taught to you because you have someone who's telling you what the real history is and not just what your textbooks is telling you about Appalachia, where I'm from. You know, watching the scene with the Sundown and the race to the county line, even though I knew that Sundown counties existed, I did not have that understanding
Right.
until I saw that. And I think that's another powerful piece of pop culture, is to help put you in that situation. I was just sitting there and I'm like, Letitia, put the gun down. He can't see the gun. You're pointing it out the window. Why are you doing that? Like, I'm gonna pull you over. Do not go over 25. Like, you can feel the intensity and just the horror of that moment that you just don't get when someone tells you in a textbook. So I think that's another way of illustrating it in a way that really captures it. There's no way I can ever understand it. This is as close as I'm ever gonna get. Right.
And I think there's another psychological level of where you're telling the story. Are you telling the story to some friends you have over for dinner, or is it on the biggest network in the United States? Right. And that matters, because that story has not been told on that stage, that largest stage yet. And so on the one hand, it's telling a story we've heard before. On the other, it's telling it in a space that it's not been told before. And I think that's part of this part of the experience, right? So,
and I think to Leandra's point too, I think that that's exactly what the documentary When They See Us did, which is something I still have not watched because it's just, I cannot. But I think that, you know, a lot of my students, they watch that for one of their sort of their COVID responsible immersion experiences. And the reaction was, oh my, that was horrific. And so reading about the Central Park Five and then seeing it, which again, I still have not seen, but I've heard how brilliantly they acted it, you know, it just brings it to a different level. I think, you know, emotionally, all of that, it just brings it to a different level. And again, I think that that's both the gift and the curse of popular culture, because I think sometimes, and in some instances, not knowing is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm protecting myself from it now. Like, I don't want that emotionally on me now because it's outside of my door every single day. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that I would agree with you, that sort of race to the county line scene was visceral for me. It was like, oh, you know, it was a lot.
And I do struggle with that, like with the trauma piece, we always resist re-victimization. So I'm always sort of like, oh, like, you know, I talk to my friends of color and I'm like, oh, well, you know, we saw it, and they're like, nope. And I'm like, you know what, you're right. Like, that is not something that you need to sit through. But I think as a white person, it's my obligation to sit through it and experience it. And learn from it. You know what I mean? And I just think that HBO is offering an opportunity for people to do that en masse. And if you can afford HBO, I guess, right? So,
well, I mean, I think one thing that I also wonder as we talk about this, how we talk about like the county line scene as being a source of trauma, you know, and I ask myself, why is it so traumatic, right? And I think to myself, it's like, you know, and I've thought to myself with a lot of the media that's come out lately, like, how would my life be different if I got to see Miles Morales, if I got to see Lovecraft Country, if I got to see HBO's Watchmen when I was 8 years old.
Yep.
How would, you know, what would that scene be to me? See, because that scene is traumatic for me because I don't have a conceptualization of a happy outcome.
Right.
Whereas if you come to this without that lack of a conception of a happy outcome to that scene, this scene actually becomes an origin story for a superhero.
Right.
So what's traumatic to me can be empowering to my daughter.
No, I really like your emphasis on, you know, the generation or the age at which you're experiencing these narratives. And it kind of gets back to my point earlier about the stories we're living in, right? And the conscious part is to tell the stories that the culture is going to live in, and to have the power, dare I say, to be actually make those stories manifest in the culture. And they do matter. They do change how people develop. And so I agree with you completely on that. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a second question? I've kind of lost track. All right, well, let's do this. Who has a favorite scene, favorite character, or favorite line they'd like to share that hasn't shared it with us already? Are we to the end of the episode? Is that where we are? Okay, anyone, any final comments? Does that mean goodbye, Stanford? Or does that mean you're waving your hand, you have a comment?
Letitia fucking Lewis.
Letitia, you gotta clap with it. 'Cause she deserves that clap.
Well, I know we're winding down, but maybe next
Please,
time.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, maybe next time, Byron, I'm really interested to say you had brought up that you had some issues with Atticus, and I'm very curious.
Yeah. What's up with that?
Well, I mean, I'll say, you know, this is from you know, since my, you know, I study literature at Morehouse, and I've always had a problem with, I hate to say this, with Black male characters in literature, with Black male writers, with you know, Black males in film. And I don't know where that comes from. I honestly don't know where that stems from, but I kept thinking, you know, and again, remember, I haven't read the book, so I kept thinking, what is he in this show? Right? And maybe I'm spoiled with Regina King's,
Yes.
you know, role in Watchmen, right? Because I guess I'm always wanting to see, and you know, and maybe it's because I'm a mama's boy. I was around my mother all her life until she passed away, and so I always appreciate the kind of empowerment I felt from her and what she gave me, the kind of gift she gave me, to grow and to always be there and always be on my side. And not that my father wasn't, but my father died when he was so young. Okay, now I'm going into all this stuff.
You're
Right?
a room with psychologists, by the way. Just keep going.
Yeah, exactly. So you know, it was always being my mother, and so I always kind of, you know, I'm always concerned about this notion of, oh, God, is he going to end up having this toxic masculinity? What's going to happen with this character, right? And so that's what kind of concerns me about him, and I'm sure it won't happen. And then when I realized he was also in The Last Black Man in San Francisco, I was like, oh yeah, now I do love him, right?
Yeah.
But I just, you know, I guess I just I'm just not seeing where, I'm just not connecting with him right now.
I kind of agree with you in this sense. Oh, go ahead.
I understand what you mean about Black men on screen and that toxic masculinity. I don't know. Has anyone seen Project Power on Netflix?
I saw the previews. I saw the clip of the young girl rapping, but I haven't actually been able to go sit down and do it.
Yeah, Jamie Foxx's
I saw some of it.
Not great, I think.
But that gets to the issue of, is there going to be a new story? Right? Is there going to be a rewriting of toxic masculinity? The beauty of Regina King's character in Watchmen, it was a goddess story. She is a goddess. She has the power to give life, and she has the power to take it. And that's a different type of mythological trope, and they executed it brilliantly. And I'm very interested to see, like you said, what are they going to do with Atticus? What different story are they going to tell with him? Do they need a different story? I'm not saying they do or don't. I'm just saying I'm looking for, what's that new insight? I'm sorry, but I keep coming back to it, but season 8 Game of Thrones was just old stories. It was
did not bring that up.
You did not. You took the words out of my mouth, Cianna. I was about to say
that.
Not.
That's my go-to.
I'm not ready to unpack that trauma yet.
Anyone else? Any final comments?
Wait, I do want to come back to Atticus really quickly.
Cool.
All right.
I am still, I don't want to be so down on the character. I'm looking forward to see what happens, how he's developed in the show. I'm just optimistically cautious.
Right.
I think that's well placed.
Yeah.
I think there's a character to develop there, right? And there's no goddess trope to rely on, right? He's got to become something to put you in a place where this is not what I expected, or it's got to be. I don't want to say a different story because they can do whatever they want. It's HBO, but to impress us, I think they need to not do something stereotypical that will not impress us. Okay, then. So that about wraps it up for tonight's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. Brothers and sisters, please tell the audience where they can find you on social media. Leandra?
Yep, I'm Leandra Parris. You can find me. I'm at William and Mary in the school psychology program, and you can also find me on Twitter at Parris Leandra at ParrisLeandra. Paris with 2 R's, not like France.
Fantastic. Cianna?
I'm Cianna Greaves, and you can find me on Twitter at CC Greaves. That's at CICIGREA, V as in Victor, E as in Sam.
Fantastic. Vanessa?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Dr. Vanessa Hintz, at Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Also on Facebook at Vanessa Hintz. Dr. Vanessa, oh my God, at Dr. Vanessa. Oh my God.
You're struck by your own stardom.
I know, like what? Well.
Stanford?
I'm Stanford Carpenter. Let's see, you can go on Twitter and you can find lots of Stanfords and lots of Carpenters, but I'm the only Stanford Carpenter on Facebook and Twitter.
Fantastic.
So it's just simple. Just go in there, type in Stanford Carpenter. You got me.
Byron?
Byron Craig, and I'm on Twitter at Byron B. Craig, no spaces, BYRONBCRAIG. I'm also at Illinois State University in the School of Communication.
Excellent. As you know, I'm Scott Jordan, and you can find me on Twitter at @dark_loops. And you can find all episodes of the Seers of Ardham at the Dark Loops production channel on YouTube. If you'd like to leave feedback about this podcast, please leave it below on this YouTube channel or send a message to darkloopsproductions@gmail.com. We'll be sure to read it at the end of our next podcast. So there it is, from all of us to all of you. Big hugs, and remember, we see you, Ardham. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You don't need no reason to travel. Unknown horrors lead